Hey, howdy, hey. Alright, friends and neighbors, let's learn all about decoctions. Decoctions are just infusions ramped up on steroids, is all they are. It's just a lot more heat and a lot more time for a plant material that's a lot more stubborn. So the basics of it, this is a liquid preparation. You are going to be boiling some tough, stubborn plant material to extract the medicinal components from therein. Remember that heat is kind of rough on most medicinal components, so you want to, usually, use whatever preparation uses the least heat, although sometimes, yeah, you gotta use heat to get this stuff out, with things like roots or rhizomes. Rhizomes are basically roots. It depends on what context we're talking about. A rhizome is botanically an underground stem. But from a practical point of view, I mean, it's underground, so it's a lot like a root. I don't want to be pedantic. I'm just saying, if you're talking to somebody and they're like, well, actually, a rhizome, so now you know, so you can talk to that person. Right, back on track. So also things like the wood, the bark, nuts, and some of the seeds. Some of the seeds are real small, and you can do an infusion with them. Some of the seeds, like nuts, are seeds, and you might want to use a decoction. You want to break the material up as much as possible. And that's not always real possible, but, you do what you can. If you have a really good blender, you might be able just to grind that stuff up into a powder, and then you wouldn't need to use nearly as much heat. You might, in fact, get away with just using it as just making an infusion rather than a decoction. And the main difference in an infusion and a decoction is in an infusion you're basically making tea, you boil water and you pour that over the herbs, and in a decoction you put them both in there together, you boil the herbs in the water. Let's look at a couple of different methods. First, the one that I call the fancy method, or the standard method, although really there's no one standard method. You can find a few different versions of this. These are just a little more scientific-y, with the intention of getting more consistent results. If you are making this for a business that you're doing and you want to have a really consistent product that you're producing. You can get your proportions all measured out, say about 50 grams of a dried herb to 1,000 milliliters of water, and that's about 5 parts by weight to 100 parts by volume, if you want to follow it that way. Either way. You put it all into a pot or a saucepan, cover it up, boil that stuff for 15 minutes. Then you're going to let it cool a bit and strain it out. You can squeeze the juices out of the plant material, and then you can add in more water to bring the volume back up to 1,000 milliliters, because some of that, even if the lid is covered, some of that is probably going to be lost to evaporation. So to keep the volume consistent, to keep everything consistent, that's what you do. Now the folk method is, I like doing the folk method most of the time for most things. There are some exceptions, but it's usually easier, and I feel like for just about everything is just as good. But what you do is you get about a teaspoon of plant material to about 30 grams of, I'm sorry, I'm reading my notes wrong, about a teaspoon of the dried plant material, or that's 3 teaspoons if it's fresh, to a cup of water. Yeah, that makes more sense. Or if you want to make a larger batch, that's about 30 grams or an ounce to about half a liter, which is about a pint. You boil that, you bring it to a boil and then reduce it to a simmer and let it simmer for 10 to 15 minutes. I like that better because the heat is a little less intense. And you want to add a lid if what you are boiling has any essential oils in it, because the essential oils are volatile oils. They evaporate really easily, so that heat just sends that stuff up into the air. If you put the lid on it, that contains it. And then strain it while it's still hot. I might put a little asterisk there that if it contains essential oils, go ahead and let it cool down and let the essential oils recondense back down into the liquid. If you're not worried about the essential oils, go ahead and strain it. Just some miscellaneous stuff is that if you want to store this, put it in a glass or ceramic or earthenware container, and you generally want to avoid a metal container unless it's got one of those coatings on it, because sometimes the chemical constituents from the plant will react with the metal and make mystery compounds, and you don't want to drink mystery compounds. Also, keep in mind that if you have 2 different plants that you want to use for some condition, and one of them calls for decoction, one of them calls for an infusion, You don't have to compromise and do one or the other. Just do the one that has to be decocted as a decoction and the one that has to be infused as an infusion. And then when they cool off, just pour that stuff together. There you go. And it's ready. It's common sense, but sometimes sometimes we don't think about that. In that picture, that's cinnamon bark, which is one of the real obvious examples that I can think of for plants that we use in decoction. Although most of the time when you are using a cinnamon stick like that, you are decocting it because you're going to make some nice apple cider or something. But you can use it medicinally or culinarily. All right, the shelf life of this stuff is going to vary by the plant. Refrigeration is going to make it last longer. You can freeze this stuff sometimes. You might want to look up online and see if you can find a good reference for whatever plant that you are using, if it will stay frozen very well. But yeah, you can freeze stuff. In general, in the fridge, expect it to last around 3 days before it has broken down enough that it's not as medicinally viable anymore. I keep trying to think of a good example of a decoction that I freeze, and I can't think of anything. I just keep thinking of cleavers, and you don't decoct those. I just make a juice out of those. We should talk about juices. It's pretty simple, but sometimes the easy stuff, the simple things, get overlooked because it just seems too simple. Let's make the next video. I've got another video that has to come out today, but let's make maybe tomorrow's video be about juices, because it's getting about the time of year to start looking into juices. And it's a pretty easy thing to do, and it can be tasty. All right, so there you go. Right, I was thinking about cleavers, which I do as a juice, and I freeze those. That one works really good. I need to go ahead and use up the last little bit of cleavers that I have frozen, because I'm going to start having fresh cleavers real soon. And now it's time for my shameless plug. I'm not seeing it on my screen, but I'm assuming that you're going to see it on yours. My Patreon page. Why don't you go on over there and you can get extra, I was going to say free bonuses, but they're not really free, are they? Because you have to pay $1. Because it's a pay thing. If you've got an extra $1 you're not using, why don't you head over there? You can get some bonus content, bonus videos, PDF notes from most of these videos that I've been doing on my 31-day video challenge. And if you want to, pay another $1 or another $1 on top of that, you can get extra things like question and answer videos, specialized for you, or monthly online hangouts and such stuff as those things. Anyway, you can go check that out if you're interested at patreon.com/foragersguide. And I will see you in the next video. But until then, keep your eyes out for plants and zombies.